I'm on public property, sir.
I said shut it down.
I'm allowed to record.
That's it.
Hey, why am I under arrest?
Stop moving. Hands behind your back.
I haven't done anything.
When badges fail, 3 stories of authority challenged. The handcuffs clicked shut with a metallic finality that echoed across the parking lot. A man stood there, his camera still recording, his wrists now bound behind his back. He had committed no crime. He had broken no law. His only offense was standing on public property with a camera in his hands, documenting what anyone driving past could see with their own eyes. The officer who detained him had no idea that within the next 15 minutes, his career would take a devastating turn. He had no idea that his supervisor was about to arrive and deliver a correction so sharp, so public, that it would become required viewing in police training academies across the state. And he certainly had no idea that this single moment of overreach would cost his department nearly $50,000 in settlement money. This is a story about power, about authority, about what happens when those entrusted to protect our rights become the very people who violate them. But more than that, this is a story about accountability, about the moments when supervisors step in and remind their subordinates that a badge does not place anyone above the Constitution. These are 3 separate incidents, 3 different cities, 3 unique confrontations, but they share a common thread that runs through the heart of American law enforcement today. If this kind of deep dive into real encounters between citizens and police interests you, make sure you stay until the very end. These stories build on each other, and the final case might just change how you think about the entire system. Let us begin in the American Southwest, in a mid-sized city called Arvada Springs, Colorado. The morning of March 15th, 2019, arrived with the kind of crisp mountain air that makes you feel alive. The sky stretched overhead in an endless expanse of blue, dotted here and there with wispy clouds that seemed painted onto the atmosphere. It was the kind of day when everything felt possible, when the world seemed ordered and reasonable. For Derek Mitchell, a 34-year-old independent journalist and constitutional rights advocate, it was just another Tuesday on his ongoing project to document government buildings from public spaces. Derek had been doing this work for nearly 4 years. He belonged to a loose network of activists who called themselves the Constitutional Transparency Coalition, a group dedicated to testing and affirming First Amendment rights across the country. Their methodology was simple but effective. They would visit public spaces, usually outside government buildings, courthouses, police stations, or federal offices. They would stand on public sidewalks or parking areas, and they would record video footage of whatever was visible from those public vantage points. Nothing more, nothing less. The entire purpose was to exercise and document the constitutional right to film in public spaces, a right that has been affirmed repeatedly by courts at every level of the American judicial system. On this particular morning, Derek pulled his silver Honda Civic into the public parking area adjacent to the Arvada Springs Municipal Building. The structure housed various city offices, but most notably, it served as the headquarters for the Arvada Springs Police Department. The building itself was unremarkable, a 3-story concrete and glass structure built sometime in the 1980s, its architecture reflecting that era's preference for function over form. American flags flanked the main entrance, rippling gently in the morning breeze. A bronze plaque near the doors commemorated officers who had fallen in the line of duty. Patrol cars sat in the adjacent lot, some occupied by officers completing paperwork, others empty and waiting for their next shift. Derek parked his vehicle legally, inserted coins into the parking meter, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. He wore dark jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and a baseball cap to shield his eyes from the morning sun. His equipment was modest, a handheld camera with decent zoom capability, and a chest-mounted GoPro that would capture a continuous, first-person perspective. He checked his batteries, verified his memory cards had sufficient space, and began to walk slowly along the public sidewalk that bordered the police station. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. Derek captured footage of the building's exterior, the parking lot, officers coming and going from their shifts. He filmed police cruisers entering and exiting the facility, civilian employees walking to their cars, a maintenance worker watering plants near the entrance. It was mundane, uneventful material, Exactly the kind of footage that, in an ideal world, would confirm that citizens can peacefully exercise their constitutional rights without interference. But this was not an ideal world. At approximately 9:47 a.m., Derek noticed movement from his peripheral vision. A patrol car that had been parked near the building's side entrance suddenly came to life, its engine rumbling as it began moving in his direction. He continued filming, his camera now capturing the approaching vehicle. The cruiser pulled to a stop about 15 feet away, its lights not activated, its siren silent. For a long moment, nothing happened. The officer inside appeared to be speaking into his radio, perhaps running Derek's description through dispatch, perhaps simply reporting his presence to supervisors inside. Then the driver's door opened and Officer Marcus Valdez stepped out. Valdez was a compact man, perhaps 5'8", with a muscular build that suggested regular gym attendance. He wore the standard patrol uniform of the Arvada Springs PD, complete with body armor, utility belt, and all the equipment that modern officers carry into their daily work. His expression was neutral but focused as he approached Derek, his right hand resting casually on his belt, not on his weapon, but in that zone of readiness that officers are trained to maintain during unknown encounters. Derek lowered his camera slightly but continued recording. His chest-mounted GoPro captured everything that followed. Derek said, his voice calm and conversational. Quote 1. Valdez stopped about 6 feet away, maintaining what trainers call a reactionary gap. His eyes moved from Derek's face to the camera to the GoPro on his chest, then back to his face. Mind telling me what you're doing here? I'm exercising my First Amendment right to film in a public space, Derek replied. He had said these words hundreds of times before, in cities and towns across America. The response he received varied wildly depending on the officer, the department, the training they had received. I'm standing on a public sidewalk, filming a public building. It's not illegal. Do you have identification? I'm not required to provide identification unless you have reasonable suspicion that I've committed a crime, Derek said. Standing here with a camera isn't a crime. What crime do you suspect me of committing? This was the moment that determined everything. The legal standard for a consensual encounter versus a detention is well established in American jurisprudence. An officer can approach anyone and ask questions. A citizen is free to decline to answer and walk away. But if an officer detains someone, prevents them from leaving, that detention requires reasonable articulable suspicion that the person has committed, is committing, or is about to commit a crime. Under Colorado state law, specifically CRS 16-3-103, an officer must be able to articulate specific facts that justify the detention. A vague feeling, a hunch, general suspicion based on unusual behavior. None of these meet the legal threshold. Officer Valdez's response would determine whether this encounter remained a brief and forgettable interaction or became something much more significant. Quote 8. Valdez said slowly, his words measured but not quite committed to any specific allegation. Quote China 9. Quote 10. Derek replied, Quote 11. What Derek said was accurate. Following years of complaints from photographers and journalists about harassment by law enforcement, DHS had indeed issued guidance clarifying that photography in public spaces is not by itself grounds for suspicion or investigation. The memorandum specifically noted that photography of government buildings, including law enforcement facilities, is protected under the First Amendment, and that officers should not treat such activity as inherently suspicious. But Officer Valdez either did not know about this guidance or chose to disregard it. He said, his tone shifting from questioning to commanding. Quote, Yes, sir. Quote 14. Derek asked, this question is crucial in any encounter between citizens and police. The answer determines the citizen's rights and obligations. If the answer is no, the citizen is free to leave. If the answer is yes, the officer must have legal grounds for the detention and must be able to articulate what crime they suspect. Valdez paused. You could see him processing the question, perhaps reviewing his training, perhaps considering his options. Then he made a decision that would define the rest of this encounter. Yes, he said, you're being detained pending investigation. I need to know who you are and whether you pose a threat to this facility. What crime do you have reasonable suspicion that I've committed? That's what I'm investigating. Now put down the camera and provide identification, or you're going to be placed in handcuffs." Derek remained calm. He had been through situations like this before, though they rarely escalated to this point. Most officers, when confronted with someone who clearly understood their rights, would back down, recognize that they were on shaky legal ground, and find a way to disengage gracefully. But Valdez seemed committed to his course of action. "I'm not going to stop filming," Derek said. "Filming police officers in the course of their duties is a constitutionally protected activity. I'm not going to provide identification because I'm not legally required to do so. You haven't articulated any crime that you suspect me of committing. Standing on a public sidewalk with a camera is not a crime. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The words hung in the morning air. Several other people had noticed the encounter now. A woman walking her dog had stopped on the opposite side of the street, watching. A man in a business suit paused by his car in the parking lot, his briefcase forgotten in his hand. Inside the police station, faces appeared at windows on the second floor, officers and staff drawn by the scene unfolding below. Derek turned around slowly. He knew what was coming. He also knew that everything was being recorded, not just by his cameras, but almost certainly by Officer Valdez's body-worn camera as well. Every word, every action, every decision would be preserved for later review. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. They were cold and hard, tighter than necessary, but not cruelly so. Valdez guided him toward the patrol car, opened the rear door, and placed him inside. Derek sat in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him, his chest-mounted GoPro still recording the interior of the cruiser. He had been detained, handcuffed, placed in a patrol car for standing on a public sidewalk with a camera. Now, here is where the story takes its turn, because what happened next demonstrates exactly why these confrontations matter, why the presence of supervisors who understand the law can make all the difference, and why the actions of a single poorly trained officer can have consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Approximately 8 minutes after Derek was placed in the patrol car, a silver Ford sedan pulled into the parking lot. It was an unmarked vehicle, but it moved with the purposeful confidence of someone who belonged here, someone with authority. The driver parked near the patrol car, stepped out, and began walking toward Officer Valdez, who was still standing near his cruiser, apparently waiting for backup or instructions. The man from the sedan was Captain Richard Torres. Captain Torres had served with the Arvada Springs Police Department for 23 years. He had started as a patrol officer, worked his way through the detective division, served as a sergeant in the training unit, and now held the rank of captain in charge of community relations and policy compliance. He was 51 years old, with graying temples and the weathered look of someone who had seen every kind of situation this job could produce. More importantly for this moment, he recognized Derek Mitchell. Not personally, they had never met, but Torres recognized him as a constitutional auditor, one of those individuals who test police responses to First Amendment activities. Torres had seen the videos online. He had watched encounters from other departments. Some handled well, many handled poorly. He had personally updated the Arvada Springs PD training materials to include guidance on these situations, and he knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that Officer Valdez was about to become the latest officer to learn this lesson the hard way. Quote 22, Torres asked as he approached. His voice was calm, measured, but there was an edge to it that suggested he already knew something was wrong. Valdez reported. He straightened slightly in the presence of a superior officer. Quote 24. Torres looked at Derek through the patrol car window, then back at Valdez. Quote 25. Quote 26. Quote 27. Valdez hesitated. Quote 28. Torres took a deep breath. In that moment, watching his body language, you could see him weighing his options. He could support his officer, back up the detention, find some rationale to justify what had already happened. That would be the easy path, the path of departmental solidarity, the thin blue line. Or he could do what his training, his ethics, and the law required. Quote 29. Quote 30. Quote 31. Quote 32. Quote 33. Quote 34. Quote 35. A pause. Quote 36. Quote 37. The silence that followed was profound. Other officers had gathered now, watching from a distance. The woman with the dog was still there, her phone now raised, recording. The man in the business suit had set down his briefcase and was watching with undisguised interest. This moment, this exact moment, would be discussed in roll calls, in training sessions, in bars where officers gathered after their shifts for months to come. Quote 38. Valdez tried. Quote 39. Quote 40. Torres said, his voice still calm but now carrying unmistakable authority. Quote 41. He turned and walked to the patrol car, opening the rear door. Quote 42. Torres said to Derek. Derek emerged from the vehicle, turning so that Torres could access the handcuffs. The captain removed them himself, carefully, almost apologetically. Quote 43. Torres said. Quote 44. Quote 45. Derek replied, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had pressed. Quote 46. Torres nodded. Quote 47. He turned to face Valdez, and what happened next was remarkable in its directness, its clarity, and its unambiguous assignment of responsibility. Valdez stood frozen, his face a mask of barely concealed humiliation. Around them, the other officers watched in silence. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked relieved that they were not the ones standing where Valdez stood. A few looked thoughtful, perhaps reassessing their own understanding of these encounters. Valdez said quietly. Torres turned back to Derek. Quote 51. Quote 52. Derek said. Quote 53. Quote 54. Torres said. Quote 55. He paused, then added. Quote 56. This exchange captures something essential about these confrontations. The presence of a supervisor who understands constitutional rights, who takes them seriously, who is willing to correct subordinates publicly when necessary. That presence can transform a potentially explosive situation into a moment of accountability and learning. Captain Torres could have supported his officer. He could have found some excuse, some rationalization. Instead, he chose to uphold the Constitution, even when that meant publicly correcting one of his own. The aftermath of this incident played out over the following months. Derek Mitchell did file a formal complaint. He also released the footage from both cameras, which quickly accumulated hundreds of thousands of views across various platforms. The video showed everything: the peaceful filming, the approach, the detention, the handcuffing, and, crucially, the intervention by Captain Torres. The Arvada Springs Police Department conducted an internal investigation. Officer Valdez was found to have violated departmental policy regarding lawful detentions. He received a 5-day suspension without pay and was required to complete additional training on constitutional rights and citizen encounters. His personnel file now contains a permanent record of this incident. More significantly, Derek Mitchell filed a civil rights complaint under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, the federal statute that allows citizens to sue government officials for constitutional violations. The city, facing clear evidence of wrongdoing captured on multiple cameras, chose to settle rather than go to trial. The settlement amount was $47,000, paid from the city's budget, which is to say, paid by the taxpayers of Arvada Springs. I want you to think about that number for a moment. Think about what it represents. Nearly $50,000 in public funds, spent not on schools or roads or public services, but on compensating a citizen whose rights were violated by an officer who did not know or did not follow the law. This is the real cost of inadequate training, of supervisors who fail to correct, of a culture that treats constitutional rights as obstacles rather than obligations. If you believe these costs should be transparent and these stories should be told, consider subscribing to this channel. We dig deep into cases like this because they reveal truths about our systems that often remain hidden. Let us move now to our second case, which takes us to the eastern coast of Florida, to a suburban city called Coral Ridge. This story unfolds not in the heat of a confrontation, but in the cold aftermath of one at a ceremony meant to honor law enforcement, but which instead became a stage for something far more dramatic. The date was September 23, 2019. The Coral Ridge City Hall, a graceful building with Mediterranean-style architecture, was hosting its annual Public Safety Awards ceremony. Inside the main auditorium, rows of folding chairs had been arranged, facing a small stage. American flags flanked the podium. Photographs of the year's honorees hung on display boards near the entrance. Families of officers, local politicians, civic leaders, and members of the press filled the seats. Everyone dressed in their best, everyone prepared for an evening of celebration and recognition. Among the honorees that night was Deputy Kevin Sandoval of the Broward County Sheriff's Office, assigned to patrol duties in Coral Ridge. Deputy Sandoval was being recognized for what the official program called his dedication to community safety and his exemplary service record. He would receive a plaque, shake hands with the mayor, pose for photographs with his family. It was supposed to be his night. Sitting in the audience, watching the proceedings with an expression of barely contained intensity, was a man named Thomas Brennan. Thomas Brennan was 57 years old, a retired software engineer who had lived in Coral Ridge for over 2 decades. He served on several local committees and had a reputation as a civic-minded citizen who attended council meetings, participated in neighborhood associations, and generally engaged with local government in the way that democracy requires, but few citizens actually practice. He was also a newly elected city commissioner, having won his seat in the most recent election cycle. But Thomas Brennan had a history with Deputy Kevin Sandoval. A history that went back nearly 5 years, to an afternoon in 2014 when their paths had crossed in circumstances that still haunted Brennan's memory. On that afternoon in October 2014, Brennan had been driving home from a grocery store when he came upon a traffic stop on Maple Drive, a residential street in his neighborhood. A sheriff's deputy had pulled over a vehicle and appeared to be in some kind of confrontation with the driver. Brennan, a citizen with a healthy interest in ensuring police accountability, pulled his own vehicle to the side of the road at a safe distance and began recording the interaction on his smartphone. He was standing on public property more than 50 feet from the traffic stop, not interfering in any way with the deputy's actions. He said nothing, did nothing, simply recorded. Deputy Sandoval, noticing the recording, approached Brennan and demanded that he stop filming. Brennan, aware of his rights, politely declined. What followed was a rapid escalation that ended with Brennan in handcuffs, arrested for obstruction of justice. The arrest report that Sandoval filed contained several claims. It stated that Brennan had approached the traffic stop in a threatening manner. It stated that Brennan had verbally interfered with the deputy's duties. It stated that Brennan had refused multiple lawful orders to disperse from an active crime scene. These claims painted a picture of a belligerent citizen interfering with law enforcement operations. There was just one problem. Deputy Sandoval was wearing a body camera that day, and the footage from that camera told a completely different story. The body camera footage showed Brennan standing quietly at a significant distance, holding his phone, saying nothing. It showed Sandoval approaching him, demanding identification, demanding that he stop recording. It showed Brennan calmly explaining his right to film from public property. It showed Sandoval growing increasingly agitated, then making the decision to arrest. At no point did Brennan approach the traffic stop. At no point did he verbally interfere. At no point did he receive any order to disperse that he then refused. The discrepancies between Sandoval's written report and the body camera footage were not subtle. They were fundamental. The report described events that simply did not occur. It was not a matter of interpretation or perspective. It was a matter of fiction presented as fact. When Brennan's attorney obtained the body camera footage through discovery, the case against him collapsed immediately. The district attorney's office dropped all charges, citing what they diplomatically called inconsistencies between the documentary evidence and the arrest report. No further action was taken against Deputy Sandoval, no disciplinary proceedings, no retraining, no acknowledgement that an officer had filed a false report. The matter simply disappeared into the bureaucratic machinery of the justice system. For 5 years, Thomas Brennan carried this experience with him. The hours spent in a holding cell, the thousands of dollars in attorney fees, the anxiety and humiliation of being handcuffed and arrested in his own neighborhood, the knowledge that a law enforcement officer had lied in an official document and faced no consequences. He had considered a civil lawsuit, but was advised that such cases are difficult and expensive to pursue. He had filed complaints with the sheriff's office, but received only form letters acknowledging receipt. He had written letters to local newspapers that were never published. His voice, it seemed, would never be heard. And then he ran for city commissioner. And he won. Which brings us back to that September evening in 2019, to the Public Safety Awards ceremony at Coral Ridge City Hall, where Deputy Kevin Sandoval was about to receive a plaque for exemplary service. The ceremony proceeded through its early stages without incident. The mayor delivered opening remarks. A local pastor offered an invocation. The police chief spoke about the importance of community partnerships. Honorees from the fire department received their awards to polite applause. Then it was time for the sheriff's office recognition. Deputy Sandoval walked to the stage, smiling, his family watching proudly from the audience. The mayor began reading from the program notes about his service record, his dedication, his contributions to public safety. Thomas Brennan stood up. The movement drew attention immediately. People turned to look. The mayor paused mid-sentence. Sandoval, still on stage, squinted into the audience, trying to identify who had risen. Quote 57. Brennan said, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Quote 58. The mayor, a woman named Elena Rodriguez, frowned. Quote 59. Quote 60. Brennan stepped into the center aisle, facing the stage, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. Quote 61. A collective intake of breath rippled through the audience. Sandoval's smile had frozen on his face. His family members exchanged confused, worried glances. The mayor stood paralyzed at the podium, clearly unsure how to handle this unprecedented disruption. The charges against me were dropped, Brennan continued, because the body camera footage showed that nothing Deputy Sandoval claimed in his report actually happened. He fabricated his entire account. He lied in an official police document, and instead of facing any consequences for that lie, he's standing here tonight being honored for exemplary service. What do you think should happen in a moment like this? Should a citizen who is wronged have a chance to speak? Or does the venue, the ceremony, the social contract of polite behavior override the pursuit of truth? I'm curious what you would do if you were in Brennan's position, carrying that weight for 5 years, and suddenly presented with this opportunity. Let me know in the comments. Deputy Sandoval finally found his voice. This is inappropriate. This is not the place for this. Then where is the place? Brennan shot back. I filed complaints. Nothing happened. I wrote letters. Nothing happened. The only reason you're not wearing a badge behind bars for filing a false police report is that your department protected you. So yes, I'm saying it here. I'm saying it now. Because apparently this is the only venue where anyone will actually hear it. The mayor attempted to regain control. Commissioner Brennan, I understand you have concerns, but this ceremony is not the appropriate forum. I'm going to have to ask you to take your seat or leave the auditorium. I'll leave, Brennan said. But I want everyone here to know what kind of officer you're celebrating tonight. He's not a hero, he's a liability. And every taxpayer in this city should be asking why he's still wearing that badge. He turned and walked up the aisle toward the exit. The audience sat in stunned silence. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked offended by the breach of decorum. A few were already reaching for their phones, recognizing that they had witnessed something that would become news. Deputy Sandoval remained on stage, the plaque in his hands. His moment of recognition transformed into something entirely different. The mayor attempted to continue the ceremony, but the atmosphere had changed irrevocably. What was supposed to be a celebration had become something complicated, uncomfortable, real. The aftermath of this confrontation played out in local media over the following weeks. Reporters, intrigued by Brennan's claims, filed public records requests for the body camera footage from the 2014 arrest. When that footage became public, it confirmed everything Brennan had said. The video showed a peaceful citizen, filming from a distance, arrested by a deputy, who then wrote a report that bore no relationship to the actual events. The sheriff's office, now under public scrutiny, initiated a belated internal review. This review uncovered additional complaints against Deputy Sandoval, complaints that had been filed and apparently ignored over the years. A pattern emerged. Sandoval had a tendency to escalate encounters, to interpret any challenge to his authority as obstruction, to document events in ways that cast his own actions in the most favorable light regardless of what actually occurred. Deputy Sandoval was not fired. The incidents were deemed too old for formal disciplinary action under departmental policies, but he was reassigned from patrol duties to an administrative role, effectively removed from direct contact with the public. His career would continue, but it would never be the same. Thomas Brennan, meanwhile, became something of a local folk hero. His willingness to speak truth to power, to disrupt the comfortable rituals of official recognition, resonated with residents who had their own stories of encounters with law enforcement. He used his position as city commissioner to advocate for stronger civilian oversight of police, for mandatory release of body camera footage in cases of disputed arrests, for policies that would hold officers accountable for false or misleading reports. This case illustrates something important about accountability and the passage of time. For 5 years, Deputy Sandoval operated without consequences for his actions. The system protected him, charges dropped, complaints ignored, career unimpeded. It took a determined citizen, someone willing to break social norms and create public discomfort, to finally bring scrutiny to his conduct. How many other cases are there like this? How many officers with patterns of misconduct continue serving because no one has the platform, the persistence, or the courage to speak up? The body camera that was supposed to protect both citizens and officers served its purpose, but only years after the fact, only because someone refused to let the matter rest. Technology alone does not create accountability. It takes people willing to demand that the evidence be seen, that the truth be acknowledged, that consequences follow when those in power abuse their positions. We come now to our final story, which returns us to the immediate tension of a street-level confrontation. This time we travel to the northeastern United States, to a small state with a long history where the tensions between individual rights and governmental authority have been debated since before the nation's founding. The state is Rhode Island, and the setting is a complex of government buildings in the city of Warwick. The morning of June 8, 2018 was overcast, the sky a uniform gray that seemed to press down on the landscape. A light drizzle had fallen earlier, leaving the streets wet and reflective. The Government Center complex in Warwick housed several state agencies, including a district court, various administrative offices, and a sheriff's department facility with a sally port for prisoner transport. Walking along the public sidewalk adjacent to this complex was a woman named Jennifer Walsh. She was 39 years old, a private investigator by profession, and more recently, an independent journalist who documented government facilities and law enforcement activities. Her camera, a professional-grade unit with excellent zoom capability, hung from a strap around her neck. A smaller camera was clipped to her jacket, providing continuous recording from her perspective. Jennifer had been doing this work for about 18 months. She had filmed outside federal buildings, state capitals, police stations, and courthouses across New England. Her videos were posted online, where they accumulated modest audiences of people interested in civil liberties issues. She was not famous, not wealthy, not politically connected. She was simply a citizen exercising her constitutional rights, documenting what could be seen from public spaces, and occasionally encountering law enforcement officers who did not understand or did not respect those rights. This morning, she had positioned herself on the public sidewalk approximately 40 feet from the Sally Port entrance of the sheriff's facility. The Sally Port was a secured area where vehicles would enter to load or unload prisoners in a controlled environment. From the public sidewalk, Jennifer could see the outer gate of the Sally Port and the general activity around it, but she could not see into the secured interior where prisoners would actually be transferred. She had been filming for about 15 minutes when a figure emerged from a side door of the sheriff's building and began walking toward her. He was a deputy sheriff, wearing the standard uniform of the Warwick Sheriff's Office, his badge glinting even in the gray morning light. His nameplate identified him as Deputy Harrison, and his shield number was 866. Deputy Harrison was a veteran of the department with 17 years of service. He was a large man, over 6 feet tall and solidly built, with a shaved head and a demeanor that radiated authority. He had dealt with protesters, troublemakers, and suspects of every variety during his career. He was confident in his ability to handle whatever situation presented itself. But this situation, this particular variety of encounter, was something his training had not adequately prepared him for. Quote 70. Jennifer said as he approached. Quote 71. Harrison stopped a few feet away, his hands on his hips. Quote 72. Quote 73. Quote 74. Jennifer had heard variations of this claim many times before, The concept of a secure area was often invoked by officers who wanted to prevent filming, but the term had a specific legal meaning that did not apply to public sidewalks, regardless of their proximity to government facilities. Quote 75, she said, calmly. Quote 76. Quote 77. Quote 78. Harrison's jaw tightened. I don't know what guidance you're talking about. What I know is that you're here with a camera pointing at our secure operations, and I need to know who you are and what you're doing. I've already told you what I'm doing. As for who I am, I'm not required to identify myself unless you have reasonable suspicion that I've committed a crime. What crime do you suspect me of? Acting suspicious near a law enforcement facility. That's not a crime. Standing on a public sidewalk with a camera is not suspicious activity. It's constitutionally protected activity. If you believe otherwise, please explain what specific crime you suspect me of committing. This exchange represents a pattern that plays out repeatedly in encounters between citizens and police. The citizen asserts their rights. The officer, uncertain of the law but confident in their authority, pushes back. The question becomes whether the officer will respect the constitutional limits on their power or attempt to impose their will despite those limits. Deputy Harrison made his choice. I'm going to need you to put down that camera and show me some identification right now. Am I free to go or am I being detained? You're being detained pending investigation. Now put down the camera. I'm not going to stop filming. Filming is not illegal, and you have not articulated any crime that justifies this detention. Harrison took a step closer. I'm giving you a lawful order. Put down the camera and produce identification. If you refuse, you will be arrested for obstruction. This was the escalation point. Harrison had committed to a course of action that put him in direct conflict with constitutional law. He believed, apparently, that his authority as a deputy sheriff allowed him to demand compliance with any order, regardless of its legal validity. He was wrong, but he did not yet know how wrong. Jennifer stood her ground. I'm not going to comply with an unlawful order. You have no legal authority to demand that I stop filming or that I identify myself. I've committed no crime. If you arrest me, it will be a false arrest, and I will pursue all legal remedies available to me. The standoff continued for another tense minute. Harrison was clearly frustrated, his face reddening, his hands opening and closing at his sides. Jennifer remained calm, her camera continuing to record everything. Other people had noticed the confrontation now. A man in a suit had stopped on the sidewalk across the street, watching. A woman pushed a stroller past, giving the scene a wide berth, but glancing over repeatedly. The morning traffic on the adjacent road slowed as drivers craned their necks to see what was happening. Then a door opened at the sheriff's building, and another figure emerged. This was Sergeant Michael Torres, a supervisor in the sheriff's department. He was in his late 40s with close-cropped gray hair and a calm, measured way of moving that suggested someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. He had been monitoring the encounter from inside, watching through a window, and had decided that intervention was necessary. "What's going on here?" Torres asked as he approached. "Sergeant, this individual is filming our facility and refusing to identify herself. She won't comply with my orders." Torres looked at Jennifer, then at her camera, then back at Harrison. "Is she standing on the public sidewalk?" "Yes, but she's pointing her camera at our operations. Has she attempted to enter any secured area?" "No, but has she interfered with any department operations? Has she said anything threatening? Done anything threatening?" Harrison's momentum was faltering. Quote 96. Torres was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to Jennifer. Quote 97. Quote 98. Jennifer said. Quote 99. Torres nodded slowly. Quote 100s. Quote fauna ewans. Quote 102. The words came from Torres, spoken quietly but clearly, and they landed like a verdict. Harrison's face cycled through several expressions: confusion, frustration, and finally a grudging acceptance that he had been overruled by his superior. "Sergeant, she's pointing a camera directly at our... She's standing on a public sidewalk, photographing things visible from that public sidewalk. There's no law against that. There's no policy against that. The DHS issued guidance years ago specifically addressing this situation. Photography of government buildings, including law enforcement facilities, is protected activity. We can't detain people for doing legal things, Deputy. That's how we get lawsuits." Harrison fell silent. The color in his face had shifted from anger to something closer to embarrassment. Around them, the small audience of bystanders watched with undisguised interest. Torres turned back to Jennifer. "Ma'am, I apologize for any confusion. You're free to continue what you're doing. We'd just ask that if you see anything that concerns you regarding our operations, you let us know. Not because you're required to, but because we're all working toward the same goal of public safety." "I appreciate that, Sergeant, and I appreciate you taking the time to clarify the situation." Torres nodded, then turned to Harrison. "Deputy, let's head back inside. We need to discuss this." They walked back toward the building together, Torres leading, Harrison following several steps behind. At the door, Torres paused and spoke to Harrison in a voice that was low but still audible to those nearby. "You should have known better. We covered this in training. And now this is going to be on video for the whole internet to see." The door closed behind them. Jennifer remained on the sidewalk for another 40 minutes, completing her documentation of the facility. No one else emerged to challenge her presence. When she finally left, it was on her own terms. Her footage captured, her rights affirmed. What makes this encounter noteworthy is not its drama, but its resolution. A supervisor intervened, recognized the constitutional issues at stake, and corrected his subordinate on the spot. There was no arrest, no escalation, no lawsuit. The system worked as it should, with those in authority understanding the limits of their power and respecting the rights of citizens. But consider how easily this could have gone differently if Sergeant Torres had not been watching, if no supervisor had intervened. Deputy Harrison seemed fully prepared to arrest Jennifer for exercising her constitutional rights. Without that intervention, she would have been handcuffed, transported to a facility, processed into the system, forced to post bail, or remain in custody until a court appearance. She would have needed an attorney, would have faced the stress and expense of fighting false charges, would have had her name appear in arrest records regardless of the eventual outcome. This is the gamble that citizens take when they assert their rights in the face of law enforcement. The law may be on their side, but in the moment of confrontation, the officer holds the immediate power. An unlawful arrest is still an arrest. The vindication that comes later, the dropped charges, the potential civil settlement, none of that undoes the experience itself. These three incidents, spanning different states and different circumstances, reveal common patterns in the relationship between law enforcement and constitutional rights. They show officers who either do not understand the limits of their authority or choose to disregard those limits. They show the crucial role that supervisors play in maintaining accountability and preventing violations from escalating. And they show the power of recording technology to document what actually happens, providing evidence that can contradict false reports and protect innocent citizens. Think about what connects all three stories. In each case, a citizen was exercising their First Amendment rights in a public space. In each case, an officer attempted to interfere with those rights, citing vague concerns about security or suspicion. In each case, the citizen knew the law better than the officer confronting them. And in each case, the presence of supervisors who understood constitutional principles made the difference between an incident and a catastrophe. But we must also recognize the element of chance in these outcomes. Supervisors do not always intervene. Body cameras are not always activated. Citizens are not always equipped with their own recording devices. For every encounter that ends with accountability, how many end with violated rights and no recourse? How many people are arrested, charged, and even convicted based on reports that do not match reality? How many lack the resources or knowledge to fight back? The settlements and disciplinary actions described in these stories are often presented as victories for accountability, and in a sense they are. But consider what they actually represent. The nearly $50,000 paid out in the Arvada Springs case came from public funds, from taxpayers who had no part in the officer's decision to make an illegal detention. The officer faced suspension and retraining, but he remained employed, still carrying a badge and a gun. The system punishes taxpayers for the misconduct of officers while providing those officers with considerable protection from personal consequences. Similarly, in the Coral Ridge case, the deputy who filed a false arrest report faced no criminal charges for what would be a crime if committed by an ordinary citizen. Filing a false official document is a serious offense, but the machinery of prosecution rarely turns toward those within the system. The reassignment to administrative duties was a consequence, certainly, but hardly proportionate to the harm caused. A citizen arrested, jailed, forced to defend himself against fabricated charges. These disparities point to deeper questions about how we structure accountability in law enforcement. When officers violate rights, who bears the cost? When departments fail to train their officers properly, who suffers the consequences? When the same patterns of behavior emerge across different jurisdictions, different states, different decades, what does that tell us about whether our current systems are adequate? If you've made it this far into this video, you're clearly someone who cares about these questions, someone who wants to understand not just what happened, but what it means. I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments. Have you had experiences with law enforcement that shaped your view of these issues? Do you believe the current system provides adequate accountability? What changes would you like to see? And if this kind of deep analysis resonates with you, consider subscribing to this channel. Every subscription helps us continue producing content that examines these crucial issues in depth. The stories we have examined today are not isolated incidents. They are examples of a pattern that repeats across the country, in cities and towns and rural areas, wherever those with authority encounter those with cameras and knowledge of their rights. The specific outcomes vary. Some encounters end with apologies from supervisors. Some end with settlements. Some end with citizens in jail cells despite having broken no law. What ties them together is the fundamental tension between the power of the state and the rights of the individual. The Constitution was written with this tension in mind. The founders understood that government power, unchecked, tends toward abuse. They understood that rights on paper mean nothing without mechanisms to enforce them. The First Amendment protects the right to record in public spaces. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. The Fifth Amendment protects the right to remain silent. These are not obscure legal technicalities. They are the foundations of a free society. But rights are only as strong as our willingness to assert them and our institutions' willingness to enforce them. The citizens in these stories knew their rights and stood by them under pressure. The supervisors who intervened understood that their duty to the Constitution outweighed any instinct to protect their subordinates from embarrassment or consequence. These are the elements required for accountability to function: knowledge, courage, and authority, willing to do what is right even when it is uncomfortable. We are left with questions that have no simple answers. How do we ensure that all officers, not just their supervisors, understand constitutional limits on their authority? How do we create consequences meaningful enough to deter misconduct without making mistakes unforgivable? How do we balance the legitimate needs of law enforcement with the legitimate rights of citizens? How do we build trust between communities and the officers who serve them? These questions matter because they affect real people in real moments. The next person to stand on a public sidewalk with a camera might be you or your child or someone you love. The outcome of that encounter should not depend on whether the officer who approaches understands the law or whether a knowledgeable supervisor happens to be watching. It should depend on a system robust enough to protect rights consistently, regardless of individual knowledge or disposition. Until we build that system, stories like the ones we have examined will continue to unfold. Some will end in accountability. Some will end in injustice. All will remind us that the rights we cherish require constant vigilance, constant assertion, and constant demand for those in power to respect the limits placed upon them. This is where we leave these stories, but not where the larger story ends. Every day across this country, citizens and officers encounter each other. Most of these encounters are routine, unremarkable, forgotten as soon as they conclude. But some become defining moments for the individuals involved and for the systems that shape their interactions. The question is not whether such moments will occur. The question is whether we, as a society, are building the structures necessary to ensure they result in justice rather than its opposite. Thank you for watching this exploration of these three cases. The incidents we examined show both the vulnerabilities in our system and the potential for accountability when the right people are in the right places. If you found value in this deep dive, please consider subscribing and sharing this video with others who care about civil liberties and police accountability. Your engagement helps us continue producing content that examines these important issues with the depth they deserve. What are your thoughts on how these situations were handled? Do you believe the supervisor's interventions represented the system working, or do they highlight how dependent we are on individual discretion rather than institutional safeguards? Would you have the courage to stand your ground if confronted while exercising your constitutional rights? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and remember that the rights we have are only as strong as our willingness to exercise and defend them.